we have a very unique speaker in the house today in the Purple Quarter podcast series. It's interesting how the entire startup ecosystem started in India, and loads of people will probably be aware of the name Flipkart. So I start with Flipkart, and because we have Mihir Dalal, who's written the Untold Story of Flipkart, rather the Untold Flipkart Story, if I'm right. So welcome to our series, Mihir. Happy to have you
Thanks,
here.
Roopa. Great to be here.
Awesome. So I've known Mihir from the time that he used to be at Live Mint, and we did talk about how you're going to start writing a book
Yeah.
and how this would be about Flipkart. So tell us a little more. How did this come to you, and how did you get a really fat book written about Flipkart?
Yeah, so I think for starters, I'd been writing on Flipkart for about 4 years before I started working on the book, which was in August 2018. So initially, I was approached by a publisher about a book on startups way back in 2015.
Okay.
If you remember, that was the first real large scale funding wave in India.
Yep.
And that's when startups became mainstream. Entrepreneurship was a cool thing and all that, right? So there was just so much interest um, uh, among publishers to really, put out something that could explain the startup world to the general public.
Sure.
But in 2015, I didn't think it was the right time because I wanted to do a book on Flipkart. But the Flipkart journey or the Flipkart story really, we didn't know really what was going to happen because at that time it was locked in this three-way war with Amazon and Snapdeal, and
Sure.
who knew, right, who was going to emerge as the winner, or where would really Flipkart be over the next 2-3 years. But in 2018, after the sale to Walmart, the Flipkart story really ended, right?
Sure.
And I think that also kind of represented this kind of the end of an era as such, because Flipkart was really one of the main reasons why there has, like, the startups ecosystem has thrived so much over the last 4-5 years, because before 2014 most people did not believe that you could build big startups out of India. In
Correct.
fact, most VCs did not believe you could build
Very
large
true.
internet startups out of
Sure.
India, because if you remember, most VCs used to fund offline companies more than internet companies
Yeah.
before 2014. But Flipkart's rise really changed all that, right? Like, after that, it was clear that you can build big internet startups out of India, that you can build even ops related startups, like ops heavy startups out of India. So Flipkart was really this pioneering startup. And but apart from all that, right, apart from its importance and its brand name, etc., the Flipkart story as such was so compelling and so fascinating, because you had all the elements of a pot boiler over there.
Sure.
And I think most people who kind of knew about Flipkart really knew about the Flipkart after 2014.
True.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, most people, even in the startup ecosystem, did not know about what Flipkart was before 2014. What it really took to build that billion-dollar company. So that was what really drew me to the story and to the book, because I felt this story has to be told in its entirety. It deserves to be told. There's so many fascinating characters who the general public doesn't know about, who many in the startup ecosystem don't know about. So yeah, so this was basically it. This is like, I wanted to kind of tell the story in its entirety from the start to the end.
You know what's interesting, because if people have actually read the Everything book by Brad Stone, and if you actually relate to your book, there's a lot of fascinating facts about how the ecosystems evolved even in India, right? From a startup perspective, from a technology perspective. Even you've covered those aspects of how they looked at technology from a very different scale, how they gotten better leaders to come and join Flipkart.
Yeah.
You've actually spoken about that. So deviating from that to a little about what we do, I'm sure Purple Quarter talks about more about technology. So could you tell us, how did you see the entire wave change? Because you did speak about the three different guys, at war. There was Snapdeal, there was Amazon, there was Flipkart. And whenever you and I would meet as well, we would actually debate who'd be the winner,
Yeah.
right? So tell me a little more. When you saw it up close, what did you see changing for Flipkart? You saw different waves, right? Different years of changes.
So yeah, so I think the Amazon comparison is obviously relevant and obvious. But I think what a lot of people I think get wrong about Flipkart is that it's just this kind of copycat of Amazon's. It's I mean I think that's a really shallow and silly argument, because if you think about it, it's not like Amazon invented the idea of selling things to people,
Correct.
or even selling things online to people, right? It was not the first online retailer.
Right.
So obviously, even Bezos copied the idea from someone else.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But what made Amazon inventive and innovative was that it really set the terms of what it means to be an e-commerce firm, right? So if any e-commerce firm enters a field, or anyone wants to compete with Amazon, it will have to compete with Amazon on its terms, on the terms that Amazon has set. Similarly with Flipkart, while the Bansals obviously were inspired by Amazon, while they copied the idea from Amazon, they really, set the terms of what it means to be an e-commerce firm in India.
Sure.
So after Amazon entered the field, it really had to play by Flipkart's terms,
Correct.
right?
Yeah.
So, that is what a lot of people don't get about Flipkart, that it is an innovative firm. It is a truly innovative firm. So I think that is something that I saw was very different, and something that has to be explained, because there's a huge misconception out there. In terms of technology, again, Flipkart was truly innovative over there, because if you remember, way back in the 2000s, even say after Flipkart started out in 2007, most e-commerce firms used to fail to deliver
Yeah.
products to people who had ordered them.
Supply chain was basically broken. Yeah.
I mean, everything was broken, right? Like the supply chain was, of course, the hardest aspect, and that was completely broken. But even something as simple as the website, like, most transactions used to fail. Like the failure rates were just unbelievable. So basically, when you went online and ordered something, it was like a lottery, right? Which is ridiculous. But Flipkart changed all that. Like they made their website very, very easy to use.
Sure.
They made it very easy for people to find stuff that they were looking for. They reduced the failure rates substantially. So like even from the technology aspect, like Flipkart really just transformed the idea of what an e-commerce firm is supposed to be, and how good an e-commerce firm is supposed to be. So I think that again is something very, very kind of unique about the Flipkart story, because no other or few other e-commerce companies were focusing on these things.
Sure.
So even as, simple an aspect as, say, your customer service address. So, there was this there was this kind of thing among e-commerce firms of that time, and they would put these unbelievably long email addresses for customer support. And the reason was that they just did not want people to write to them.
Sure.
The Bansals came up with this idea, Sachin came up with this idea that we should actually have the shortest possible address, because we actually want people to write to us. We want to improve. Even if people want to complain, we want to hear their complaints, because eventually we want to improve. So they kept a very, very simple email address that anyone could remember, right? So even the attention to detail was really, really strong on Flipkart, especially in comparison with other e-commerce sites. So on any aspect, from technology to marketing to supply chain, they were very, very serious about solving these problems.
Sure.
And not just kind of, they were not just out there to fool people into buying from them, or just kind of having an e-commerce firm for the sake of it. So I think that is something that really separated them from the others. Just the seriousness that they had in actually solving the real problems that were holding back e-commerce.
Sure. So your book actually covers a lot about even what went right for them and what didn't go right during a part of time. And you also, very brilliantly spoke a lot about how their vision was about the company, because most books don't really cover too much about what a founder really feels like. It's very easy from the outside to say, hey, this company is not doing well, and their sites don't work, their app doesn't work, but there's a lot that goes behind scenes, right, at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So when you actually capture these moments, and I think some of the people that have actually read your book, or you've had them quote that, you've been like this fly on the wall, and you've been watching this up and close, and knew exactly how these guys were feeling. So were there some moments where you thought you don't want to write about certain things, or
Yeah, of course. I mean, there were a lot of such decisions, because I mean, on the whole, I worked full time on the book for almost a year, and as I said, right, like I had been covering Flipkart for 4 years before that. So I mean, by the end of that 1 year that I was working full time, I had I'd done more than 250 interviews.
Wow.
Just for the book.
Okay.
And this is not including the interviews that I had already done for Mint for 4 years.
Okay.
Right. So I had collected a lot of information, and the book is controversial. It anyway has a lot of sensitive information. Of course, there were other aspects. There were some details that I chose to not include. And the way I went about it was this: that after working for about 4 to 6 months, I had a pretty good idea of what the narrative is going to be. When I was actually writing the book, so for the first 4 months I was just reporting. Then I started writing, and then along with writing, I continued to report. But the decision of whether to include or not include something was based on whether it was relevant to the narrative.
Sure.
Right? Like, I mean, there was this, like, a lot of people have said that the second half of the book is very, very detailed about the politics at Flipkart. I mean, there was a lot more of it, but
Okay.
but I only included things that I felt were relevant to the narrative.
Sure.
Which was basically around what it means to build a pioneering internet startup in the 21st century in India.
True.
Right? So that was basically the focus of the narrative, and stuff that was relevant to it I included, stuff that was not I didn't. But yes, there were certainly a lot of details that were both controversial and not controversial that I chose not to include because they were not necessarily relevant to the narrative, and they would not have enhanced a reader's understanding of Flipkart and
Sure.
of what it meant to build this company.
Right. So did people ever, after reading the book, did they come back to you and talk about, would you be writing another part 2 about Flipkart on certain things that you didn't cover? Or did people come back and talk about it? Or are you going to be writing a book about another startup?
No. I mean, I think the Flipkart story is really, it's unique.
Right.
And I think it's also unique, not just because it's a pioneer, because the Flipkart story also shows a lot about like India as such,
Sure.
because I mean, if you remember in the 2000s, especially in the early 2000s, there was a lot of talk about how India is going to be the next superpower. Along with China, and it's going to rival the US. So basically, this was supposed to be India's century, right? And if you look at Flipkart, it's this kind of like it was India's answer to Amazon and Alibaba.
Right.
But it did not actually come anywhere near the kind of scale that Amazon and Alibaba have achieved. And a lot of it was because of its own missteps. Of course, there's a perspective that says that even if Flipkart hadn't screwed up the way it did in 2015, it may not have really become a 100 billion company the way Sachin wanted it, right? But there is no doubt that it would have still been a 50 billion company or so, right? Or 40 billion, whatever it is, which is much, much larger than what Flipkart is right now.
Right.
So a lot of its missteps, even the sale to Walmart, right? Like the Bansals or even their investors, it's not like they wanted to sell the company,
Yep.
But they were forced to sell the company because there was really no realistic exit path for them apart from the Walmart sale. So the fact that they were forced to sell the company, shows that, I mean, this was, even despite its size, like a 16 billion sale in India is of course record breaking, but despite that, it was still a bittersweet tale. So I thought that it was a very good kind of parable of the post-liberalization era in India,
Sure.
where, of course, India has economically progressed a lot after 92, after 91, after the liberalization of the early 90s. But has it really, achieved the kind of success that was envisioned at that time, or even in the 2000s? No. So I thought, it's a good parable of how the post-liberalization era has worked out.
Sure.
Both in terms of the ambition and in terms of the missteps and failures that have kind of held back the country and the company from realizing its potential.
Right.
So I think it's a really unique story. Of course, there are many other interesting startup stories, but no, like
You're not writing. All right. But I think most of the viewers who are watching this podcast need to know that every startup will have, learnings as well as success moments. So it's never going to be a hunky-dory saying that, hey, everything's going to be up in the air and everything's going north.
Absolutely.
So even for the story that you've actually gone ahead and written about Flipkart, I think it was beautifully articulated, talking about even the things that went wrong, because it's important for one to know that a journey has both, right, at the end of the day. I think it's beautifully done by both the Bansals. Kudos to them for whatever they've created. Because of Flipkart, there's so many other startups that have mushroomed. Yeah, and today people are able to invest in startups.
Yeah.
India is recognized, thankfully, due to these folks, right?
Yeah.
They're one among those very few who actually made it happen.
Absolutely. I mean, Flipkart put India on the startup map globally.
Absolutely.
Like, there's no doubt about it.
True.
Yeah.
No, but for you to having, the first person to pen that down, I think kudos to you as well. And looks like you also won an award for yourself, one of the most prestigious awards. So how do you feel when you got, recognized?
I was very surprised because...
You were surprised, all right?
Yeah, because, generally, the market in India for business books, I mean, there is a market for business books, but there is not the ecosystem for narrative nonfiction in business is very, very like nascent, right? So, I mean, so much has happened in India over the last 30 years. And yet, how many books can you name that, you would say that, oh yeah, this like really helps me understand, like say a Tata's or the Ambanis or the Mahindras or like dozens of other businesses like Airtel, Infosys, etc. Right? So the market, the ecosystem for narrative nonfiction is very, very nascent.
Sure.
So mine was like kind of the first narrative nonfiction book from the startup space. So we really didn't know what to expect. I mean, we were just like, I mean, there was no kind of reference point as such that, oh, okay, so once the book is published, this will happen, that will happen.
Sure.
So it was just like, let's see what happens.
Okay.
So yeah, it was of course great to be recognized, but I mean, it's not even, like we had planned to even apply for these awards, because even the Gaja Capital Award, the first edition of that was really last year.
Sure.
So, and one of their aims is to help people write more business books, more books that can, really narrate to a wider public, to the wider public as to, how businesses are built, right? So, I mean, that's how nascent it is, that this award has been created to support, to encourage people to like write books like that. So yeah, so I mean, of course, it was great to be recognized, but we had no idea that,
Got it. But when you were actually, playing the role of a journo, and you were also looking at other startups, I'm just moving away from your book now, and let's talk a little bit about all the other domains you were covering as well. So what did you see? Because see, for us, people who are on the other side, we look at startups very differently.
Yeah.
Right? But print looks at it slightly in a very different concept.
Yeah.
So do tell us, how did you see the entire technology wave happening across different domains? If you can name a couple of them who you closely follow, it'll be like brilliant.
Right. So I think the way the media covers or used to cover, right, has completely changed. Used to cover startups has completely changed after 2014-15.
Okay.
Because what happened was that the first dot-com wave in India, which was in the late 90s and early 2000s, that wave ended almost as soon as it began.
True.
Because
there's a bubble.
Yeah, there was like very poor internet infrastructure. There was very little funding available, very little understanding of internet businesses, right? So it kind of just ended almost as soon as it began, and a lot of media folks saw what happened. They saw the kind of ambitions and the tall tales that entrepreneurs used to sell, and they were like, "Oh, this is just crap. This is bullshit." Then the venture scene was really rebuilt in India in 2005, 6, 7, right? And again, there was a kind of small scale funding boom, but even that turned out to be a bubble because the financial crisis really put an end to funding, right?
True.
So again, the media saw that and said, "Oh, these guys they just keep selling us like tall tales." And then between 2010 and 14, right, when companies like Flipkart, Snapdeal, Ola, Paytm were being built, there was still a lot of skepticism about these companies, and rightly so, because it's not like reporters set out to kind of pull these companies down or something, but even if you just spoke to people in the ecosystem, right? Even if you spoke to venture capitalists, even they would like just be so skeptical about these startups. Like Sequoia, for instance, which is like the biggest VC fund in India. They refused to touch e-commerce companies till 2014, right?
True.
Like they only became an investor in Snapdeal because Snapdeal got free charge. So there was just so much skepticism. But then the 2014-15 wave just totally changed, right? Because it was because of a combination of factors. Now you were seeing startup scale, you were seeing what had happened in China, you were actually using these products, right? Like, for the first time, you were buying from Amazon, you were buying from Flipkart, you were taking Ola, Uber rides.
Absolutely.
And you were seeing it work.
Yeah.
Like it was not like the way it used to be in the past, right?
Correct.
Where, like say you met an entrepreneur, he would like boast about a startup.
But you don't know anything about it.
You don't know anything about it, and then you went home and placed an order, and it didn't reach you for like 6 months. So you were like, what? This just like I was just sold a stupid tale. So that all changed, and then the ecosystem was like being created, and despite the funding slowdown of 2016 and 17, it still held. It just kept getting stronger, right? And it was not just e-commerce. You had food tech, you had cab aggregation, you had financial services, hotels. It was a much wider and diverse and stronger ecosystem being created. So that is when the whole thing from the media side changed, that we have to take this seriously, we have to cover it seriously. And then of course the media went on the other end, which was that
we have to take things very seriously.
And there was just too much coverage, right? Like just think about the number of publications that write on startups. It's quite crazy. Like we don't give so much attention to sectors that are far bigger than the internet space. But of course there is a reason for that, which is that this is the business of the present and the future, right? This is not, this is one of the few businesses that you can blindly say that it is just going to get bigger. So that is what really is behind the approach that the media takes to internet businesses. Now, I think, like you said, now there is A, too much coverage, and B, there is like people tend to believe stuff too much now, right? So, of course, there needs to be a balance, because right now what you have is you have the mainstream media, which kind of looks at most startups in not a very critical way, and then you have online publications which are probably too critical of companies, right? Like just their attitude towards companies is that. So of course there has to be a balance where like say if you're meeting a startup, you speak to a range of people who are connected to that company and to that sector. And, even when you're writing about fundraisers, for a startup that has no revenues, Series A, B, C, right? Like you, of course, you cover that, but you also write about what are the pitfalls, what is the bearish view on this company. So yeah, so that I think as long as people write in that way, people cover these companies in that way, I mean, it will obviously help create a more healthy ecosystem where the both the positive view and the critical view is brought out.
Right. So, but don't you feel that even in media, there are quite a few people who don't understand how the ecosystem's actually, brewing, right? It's all around technology. Let's look at what happened last year. Yeah, the COVID hit us all by surprise. Then everybody started saying, okay, O2, offline to online. Everybody wanted to be digital. And in fact, I think we must take pride that on today's date and time, at least the city we are in Bangalore, it's completely digital. Everything you can do with the use of a smartphone.
Yeah.
In fact, you go to the smallest towns, even in India, you're able to, have a Google Pay or any of these transactions, or a Paytm or a Phone Pay, and get done with it, right? So when you look at it, the point that I was trying to make is most of the people who come from your community, do they understand how important it is to cover the right things, right, in media? Because I've read myself a lot about how things are being covered, how people are not being spoken about in the right light. Companies are being spoken about in real poor light in media. And it's also having an impact on the kind of investors who want to put in money.
Right.
So how much do you take accountability? Because you're sitting on the other side of the fence.
So, I would say that, of course, it's not perfect, right? I mean, because it's covered by humans and it'll never be perfect.
Okay.
But I think if you look at it from like a bigger picture perspective, right? Like the media has actually played a very, very it has been one of the biggest enablers of the startup ecosystem, right? Like, why is there this perception in the general public now or in the corporate world that the pinnacle of the corporate world is to actually be an entrepreneur,
right?
To be a successful entrepreneur.
Correct.
Like, why is that? That is because the media has portrayed it in that way, right? So, I mean, I take your point that the understanding of reporters should be better when they're writing on companies and on the sector. But if you look at the bigger picture, the media has actually played a far, by far a positive role in shaping the perception of the startup ecosystem.
Sure.
So I think my view is that there needs to be a balance that, you kind of, like I said, you portray both the positives and the ugly things about companies, right? So, I mean, of course, it's hard to get that balance right because in this 24 hours news cycle, you're just kind of chasing news all the time and you're chasing headlines, right? But I think that balance, will hopefully come as this ecosystem matures more. Because, I mean, you have to remember, this is still pretty much a 5-6 year old kind of, endeavor because most media companies, most journalists have been only writing on this for like 5-6 years and have been only treating this seriously for 5-6 years, right? So I think as it matures, I think the coverage will get better. And that is also helped by the fact that, a lot of journalists are starting their own media companies, right? So when there is a diversity of opinion, hopefully that competition will will push people to improve the way they cover startups. So I think, accountability needs to be there. But we have to remember that the job of the media is not really to, say, portray someone in a positive light or a negative light or something, right?
Glorify or non-glorify.
Exactly. For instance, there have been times many times actually, when, say someone breaks a story on startup A being in talks to raise money from investor B. investor B gets pissed off that this news was published and pulls the term sheet or something, right?
Yeah.
I mean, but like the startup and the investor can blame the reporter for it, but that is not like the reporter's concern. That is not his concern that this has happened, because I mean that is the kind of thing that you're supposed to do. You're supposed to report what is happening, right?
Sure.
So I mean, yeah, like it would be helpful if reporters are probably more aware of the consequences, but that should not stop them from writing what is happening, right?
Sure.
Like, of course, you should be measured, you should be balanced, you should have all the journalistic kind of checks and balances. But even after all this, the consequence could be that the startup will be hurt.
Right.
But in most cases, actually, the startups benefit a lot from media coverage, So,
Sure.
I mean, yeah, like I see what you're saying, but that I think is inevitable. That,
Right.
Some people will get hurt, whereas some people will benefit from media coverage.
Got it. So Mihir, just moving along, if you remember our coffee chats, we speculated about which domains or which companies will do well. So would you like to tell our audience what are your current speculations? You don't have to name companies, but you can talk about domains. It'll be super helpful for us to say because you cover them. So it'll be interesting for us to also note the kind of technology they could be making or the products that they're going to, put out there in the market.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think obviously education,
Right.
that is
Yeah.
like, I mean, it's just exploding.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Reminds me of how Flipkart and Snapdeal and Amazon.
Yeah,
Those
yeah.
days when we had those chats, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. But I think what's also happening is that, you're seeing companies that are creating new markets in education, right? That are kind of creating new demands as such in education. Like, for instance, even something like White Hat Junior. I mean, there was no coding for kids before.
Yeah,
White Hat
absolutely.
came.
No one heard of it.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
this is a very good example of how, the internet space is changing business itself and is changing like very, very fundamental things about even society, right?
Correct.
And culture. So education, I think, is one example,
Sure.
which is just kind of exploding. I think financial services is probably the most undecided space where there's so much scope to create large companies.
Sure.
But there's so much uncertainty both on the regulatory side and on like how people are how people want to kind of use financial services, that we just don't know what's going to happen. But this is one space where there is tremendous scope for disruption and for creating large companies.
Right.
And we already have so many, like dozens of financial services companies, right?
Yeah.
And most of them, if you notice, are trying to become, like they want to eventually become like a comprehensive financial services provider for their customers.
Sure.
So that is a very interesting space, both in terms of the ability to create large companies and in terms of what is going to happen to the existing startups that are out there, because it's a given that a majority of them will fail.
Right.
In the sense that even if they don't go under, they will not achieve what they set out to do.
I'm looking more of a consolidation of some sort.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
that is a given, right?
Yeah.
At some point, right? Because you can't have like 30...
Absolutely. Yeah. So many players in the market.
Yeah.
Confusing the customer. Yeah.
And also like serving like a base of what, like 100 million at most,
Right.
Like, I mean, that is UPI, right? Like,
Sure.
basically there are 120 million active UPI users. The market is refusing to go beyond that for the last 2 years. Even though UPI usage has, in terms of the value, is constantly increasing. But if you look at the number of active users, right, it's just not going beyond 100 million.
Right.
So you have like dozens of companies just catering to these 100 million people. And, the spending power again in India is concentrated in the top 30 million at most, right? So, I mean, how much are you going to, like, how can you make money is the question that no one is able to answer. No one has been able to answer so far. So, I mean, there is just so much scope for disruption, consolidation, etc.
Sure.
So, it is like the biggest wide space of market available right now, but also the most uncertain. So
Right.
financial services is going to be one of the most interesting sectors. I think even content looks interesting, especially after the China apps ban.
Right.
But the problem with content is again, monetization, right? Like, I mean, it's been very clear that
It'll be a long story to monetize.
yeah, and we don't know if the monetization can ever catch up with the valuations of
Yeah.
some of the biggest
Very
content startups right now,
Sure.
right? Like, of course, they are going to be solid businesses, but are they going to be able to generate the revenues and profits that can justify their valuations? We don't know, because while companies like Daily Hunt and ShareChat and even InMobi's
InMobi
glance,
glance, yeah.
they have benefited a lot from the China ban. Google and Facebook have only become bigger. Like, a lot of the monetization and the monetization potential that has been kind of lost because by the likes of TikTok has gone to Google and Facebook. So, we just don't know if these startups will be able to generate the kind of revenues and profits that justify their valuation.
Only time will tell. Yeah, I agree.
So I think these three sectors, look particularly interesting.
Amazing. So, since we were speaking about sectors, and I just wanted to check with you, most people don't read nowadays. And I think just before we started our, podcast, we spoke about how the video or the series are going to become the most relevant things for today's generation, right?
Yeah.
So, are you looking at a movie or a video series instead of a book?
No. So a production house has bought the video rights to the book, so they're going to
create one. Okay.
Yeah, so they're adapting it into a web series. But I think you're like increasingly what you're going to see is even journalists who focus on print and who are like kind of text based, they will have to learn how to be able to tell stories and report in a multimedia format over the next 10 years. I mean, I don't think it's going to happen like immediately, but if we just look at, say, what is happening with some of the biggest newspapers like New York Times, their multimedia storytelling format has just opened like a range of new possibilities.
Right.
So I think from that perspective, publications will have to learn how to kind of report and tell stories across formats. So I mean, we're already seeing this kind of boom in audio content. That is just a precursor of how you're going to need to keep experimenting with forms to kind of tell your stories. Like, it's not just going to be like only newspapers or only videos or only audio. At some point, you're going to have to kind of merge these mediums and experiment with new forms.
So you're saying it's not going to be one format, it could be multi-format that will come in.
Yeah, I mean, I'm saying that while these forms will continue to exist, independently,
separately,
but there will be a need to also present multimedia stories. So that is the new element that is going to be added. Where
have you started that already? Have you started that?
No, it's very difficult. I mean, because you need investment.
Sure.
Right? You need an institution to actually build these capacities and to build the infrastructure to support this kind of format. Because even the Times, which is just been among the most successful, probably the most successful among media outlets in multimedia storytelling. I mean, it's taken them years and like millions of dollars of investments, right?
Sure.
So it's not just that you need to kind of upskill as a journalist to be able to tell stories in these forms, but you also need your organization to invest in the infrastructure that can allow you to tell stories.
Is this a call out for investors?
Well, I mean, I don't think any investor is going to touch,
Or you already sunk the ship, before it could set sail.
Yeah. It's such a difficult business.
Got it. So, would you have anything to tell our, the founders who are watching or investors who are watching, as a media representative? Would you want to talk to anybody who wants to reach out to you? Do you have any last few words?
So I would just say that entrepreneurs should actually invest the time, even more than the money. Like apart from hiring, like say PR folks or something, they should invest the time in understanding how the media works.
Sure.
Because like you were saying, about like how sometimes things are misrepresented.
Right.
But a part of the reason that this happens is also because entrepreneurs have no idea about how the media works and what is its function, right?
Right.
So if you look at companies that are the most successful in the way they deal with the media or the image that they have, that is because they have taken the time to understand how the media works. They've taken the time to build relationships with reporters. I mean, of course, they use it very cleverly, but they know how the media works.
Sure.
So and because now the perception of a startup has become so important, right? I think if entrepreneurs take the time to understand how the media works, I mean, that is going to be that will be very helpful to.
Maybe I think you should blog it. How does the media work?
Yeah.
Sure. Thank you so much, Mihir, for being on our show. Really loved talking to you. It seemed as breezy as the way we would have a conversation when we're having coffee, right? So thank you so much for being here. Happy to hear from you if you have anything else to tell our audience.
No.
All right. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.